Unfortunately, it was written for an audience who was largely unfamiliar with phenomenology, so forgive me for any simplifications. In our exploration of phenomenology of religious experience, we find that there are two large oversights concerning both James's role in the development of phenomenology and what his work offers contemporary phenomenology of religious experience. The purpose of this paper is to show James's place in the wider narrative of the phenomenology of religious experience, and ultimately how his connection to Husserl can shed light on the contributions that James's work can offer current scholarship. We do not argue for a return to a strictly Husserlian phenomenology of religious experience, but only wish to show that James's work on religious experience exhibits the hallmarks of Husserlian phenomenology. James certainly uses an early form of the same methodological elements as Husserl, but as we shall see, he did not live long enough to bring the essential structures of phenomenology that he was formulating to complete fruition. Acknowledging his role in the development of phenomenology and the phenomenological nature of his work can lead us to re-examine the varieties of religious experience as an early example of a phenomenology of religious experience. The first section here is called the historical link. Among the many figures who connect Husserl and James are friends Brentano and Carl Stumpf. Stumpf, to whom Husserl dedicated logical investigations, was Husserl's advisor at the University of Halle. He was 10 years Husserl's senior and an outstanding student of Franz Brentano. Husserl and Stumpf met in Halle, where Husserl was first a graduate student under Stumpf and later his colleague. Stumpf is considered by many to have been influential in exposing psychology to phenomenological methods. Stumpf met James in Prague on October 30th, 1882. Stumpf was working on a book on the psychology of music at the time, and the two agreed on some aspects of the immediacy of perception. During James's time in Prague, Stumpf escorted him around the city, and the two became close friends and later correspondents. At this time, James became aware of Stumpf and Brentano's work in descriptive psychology. James thought very highly of him, as he did of Brentano. In the Principles, James writes, "Stumpf seems to me the most philosophical and profound of all these writers, and I owe him much." The friendship resulting from James and Stumpf's meeting was lifelong, but this encounter's later influence on Husserl was particularly important. After meeting James, Stumpf suggested to his colleague Husserl that he read James's work. Despite the importance of this meeting, the most important figure in the influence of both James and Husserl was Franz Brentano. Brentano was aware of the language of phenomenology, but not as it would later be defined by Husserl. One version of Brentano's notes for a course he gave in 1888 bears the title Descriptive Phenomenology, rather than Descriptive Psychology, as the final copy would be titled. Phenomenology for Brentano was defined as a scientific philosophy through which one could examine consciousness and its objects. In his inaugural address at the University of Vienna, he explained why philosophy had not yet reached as scientific and rigorous a method as the natural sciences had. He argued that this was due to the complexity of psychology, which was considered at the time to be the basic philosophical discipline, and that its complexity would require a longer amount of time for its methodology to reach maturity. Husserl studied under Brentano during 1884 to 1886. Husserl is liberal in his acknowledgement of Brentano, just as he is with James, praising Brentano as, quote, his one and only teacher. Much clearer evidence of Husserl's reliance on Brentano than of his reliance on James, simply because Husserl's letters to his teacher have been preserved and are explicit in their gratitude. For example, Husserl begins a letter in 1889 to his teacher, quote, "My most heartfelt wishes for your happiness and health in the new year, as well as for that of your dear ones, and my best wishes for the flourishing and completion of the great creation to which you have devoted your mental powers for years, and from which the scientific philosophy can expect such great advance. Indeed, its correct and lasting foundation. It was for me an inexpressible joy to find in your new treatise the prospects for your work on descriptive psychology. So close, and to be honest, not only for the expected advancement of our science, but no less for the joyful hope of an essential advance in my own knowledge. Thus I will again feel the great happiness that I so gratefully enjoyed when I was still sitting at your feet, the happiness of being enlightened by your clarity, of sharing in the thoughts, projects, and successes of your ever-penetrating mind." Not the Husserl most of us are familiar with reading. Husserl is similarly explicit in his praise of James, but such praise is much harder to find because it occurs largely in footnotes and singular mentions rather than in glowing letters. Husserl clearly states that influential James was on his own work. While lecturing at the university, Husserl in his journals regards James's principles of psychology as, quote, "The psychology of James, of which I was able to read only a few passages, furnished me with some insights, and attempted to hold fast to what he said and describe it." You can also see in the personal copy of the principles of psychology how extensively he considered James's ideas regarding intentionality and consciousness. Husserl once suggested that he intended to write a descriptive psychology, but felt that, quote, James had said what he wanted to say. Husserl credits James in Logical Investigations with aiding him in his emancipation from psychologism, an insight he gleaned from his readings of the principles in the 1890s. It is one of few references to James found in Husserl's published writings. It will be apparent from the present work, Husserl writes, that James's genius-like observations in the field of descriptive psychology of the cognitive experiences are far from making psychologism inevitable. For the help and progress which I owe to this excellent investigator in the field of descriptive analysis have only aided my emancipation from the psychologistic position. It is clear from this reference in Logical Investigations that Husserl considered James to not only be a great thinker, but a companion in his pursuit to avoid psychologism. Section 3 is called the methodological link. James Eadie, a leading James scholar, explored the connection between James and Husserl in his 1987 publication, Wiilam, James and Phenomenology. He wrote in his chapter on James's phenomenological method that, quote, "It is only because of the intrinsic and logically necessary convergences within James's philosophical discoveries and those of the phenomenologists that we can show that they make contributions to what is, in essential respects, the same program, that they hold fundamental doctrines in common, and that these doctrines are thus intrinsically and necessarily fated to the same philosophical triumph or failure." Eadie believed that James strongly influenced the development of these fundamental doctrines that were to become essential to phenomenology. He was not the only one who acknowledged how many of these doctrines James had helped develop. Husserl himself acknowledges in The Crisis of the European Sciences that James had in fact discovered everything necessary to put together a theory of transcendental phenomenology, but was not able to develop the ideas fully in his time. To address James's methodological similarities with Husserl, we must begin by explicating the distinct methodological perspective that constitutes Husserlian phenomenology. As Husserl's scholarship developed, so did his phenomenological method. This is not the place to detail how Husserl's conceptions developed throughout his scholarship. We note this distinction because we will mention only some of the key components of his method, and though it will cover some ideas from both early and late Husserl, it will not by any means be a complete view of Husserl's phenomenology. The following analysis, in combination with the previous section, forms the basis of our argument in the sense that without a clearly documented historical connection to Husserl, as well as an ideological connection, it would be difficult to claim the phenomenological nature of his ideas. We plan to establish that we have not chosen James randomly as someone who demonstrated a method similar to Husserlian phenomenology. The connection is well documented and recognizable once one looks. Before further discussion, it should be noted that Husserl's phenomenology is primarily intended to be a rigorous descriptive science, which seeks to provide a way of discussing experience free from prejudices and presuppositions. Husserl sought to return to experience and investigate states of consciousness and their objects in a manner that was true to how they appear. Most phenomenological approaches that resulted from Husserl's initial fathering of the method attempt to do the following four things: describe consciousness and its objects, recognize the role of intentionality, make use of a system of phenomenological bracketing, and strive to recognize the essence of phenomena. These aspects are essential to his project and developed early on in the work of James. Let us begin with experience, which for James is a dynamic, quote, stream of concepts, images, intuitions, feelings, and intimations, much of which may only tantalize our awareness at the fringe, but which colors and tints the whole of our experience in pervasive and profound ways, end quote. James identifies experience as the basis through which we conceptualize the world. James scholar Jason Bloom argues that James's view of experience not only revises Western epistemology up to that point, but rejects it entirely in favor of, quote, a perspective that emphasizes the vague, affective, dynamic, and ineffable dimensions of experience in addition to its lucid, discursive, logical aspects, end quote. A significant part of James's theory of the stream of consciousness was his development of the idea of intentionality, which Husserl takes up and characterizes as any act of consciousness, ultimately being a consciousness of something. Brentano was the first to begin forming a law of intentionality. He discovered that, quote, we can therefore define mental phenomena by saying that they are those phenomena which contain an object intentionally within themselves, end quote. In Dale Jacquet's introduction to Brentano's work in the Cambridge Companion to Brentano, he focuses on intentionality, noting, quote, this intentionality thesis inspired generations of philosophers and psychologists, some of who developed Brentano's ideas in a variety of different directions, radiating out from his original investigations, end quote. Though James Eadie does claim in a footnote that James is certainly Husserl's source for this and similar locutions, it is likely that he did not develop these ideas based on James alone, but rather a combination of his own earlier studies in psychology, Brentano's ideas on intentionality, and James's expansion of Brentano's ideas. We move now to the epoche, Husserl's process of bracketing the natural attitude in order to focus on the object of consciousness as it is given to consciousness. The natural attitude, Husserl argues, is the attitude within which we operate on a day-to-day basis. In this attitude, we encounter the objects of our experience as real and existent separate from our experience of them. In the natural attitude, we recognize a table and label it as such without any further examination. In contrast to this natural attitude, it is possible to adopt a phenomenological attitude that brackets our belief in the natural attitude and recognize it as a belief. Once we mark it as a belief, we can choose to suspend it. Note that we are not choosing to disbelieve the natural attitude, only to suspend it. We do not deny having presuppositions, but we are freed from unexamined presuppositions when we render them explicit. Husserl identifies this act of bracketing as the phenomenological epoche, or the phenomenological reduction. This reduction allows us to reconsider the world in the phenomenological attitude. While employing the phenomenological reduction, a phenomenologist makes no determination of the ultimate existent reality of what is experienced, but rather witnesses it just as it presents itself and attempts to describe it and investigate its essential structures as such. James was focused on developing this manner of inquiry. As John Drabinsky writes, quote, both James and Husserl express the following philosophical sentiment. The dualism at work in the modern period rests on abstractions, and these abstractions can be undercut if one properly examines one's lived experience in its immediacy, end quote. Lastly, we arrive at the idea of the eidos, or essence, which lies at the core of the phenomenological method. The goal of the phenomenological reduction, as stated earlier in the introduction, is to examine phenomena in order to discover something about their essential structure. The term eidetic stems from the Greek term eidos, which Husserl appropriated from Plato, who used the term to designate universal essences. The phenomenologist works from examples of real, concrete life-world experience towards a recognition of what constitutes them and the ways in which we recognize them as such. Husserl writes that phenomenology is ultimately concerned with being, quote, a descriptive eidetic doctrine of transcendentally pure mental processes as viewed in the phenomenological attitude, end quote. We see all of those phenomenological elements present in James's The Varieties of Religious Experience, to which we now turn. James's Varieties was groundbreaking in its approach to describing religious phenomena through a psychological as well as phenomenological lens. Many researchers examining the commonalities in James's and Husserl's work have relied heavily on James's principles of psychology, but didn't touch on the varieties. We see in the varieties James carrying out the psychological and phenomenological method he began in the principles. James's approach in the varieties demonstrates an early phenomenological method used for the study of religious experience. Section 4, the phenomenological structures in the varieties. Religion, James remarked in 1898, acted as the great interest of his life. Consciousness of the transcendent, the nature of God, and the question of God's existence were issues that occupied James's mind many times throughout his life. In 1899, James was offered the Gifford Lectureship at the University of Edinburgh and chose religious experience as his subject matter. He embarked on a series of lectures that later culminated in a book entitled The Varieties of Religious Experience, a Study in Human Nature. True to his pluralistic position, James was always open to evaluating the fruits of the religious life regardless of an individual's religious beliefs, ecclesiastical traditions, or theological positions. Thus, when James began to collect personal testimonies and various source materials, which he would study for the creation of these lectures, he did not intend to extract from them any concrete conclusions about theology or the structure of organized religion. His intention was to describe religious experience in a methodological manner, while staying true to the richness of those experiences in order that we might understand what makes religious experience identifiable as such. In his lecture, Circumscription of the Topic, James writes, quote, "The essence of religious experiences, the thing by which we finally must judge them, must be that element or quality in them which we can meet nowhere else." End quote. Turning to the varieties, we will now establish that James's methodology in approaching religion is perhaps one of his most important contributions in advancing the phenomenological movement. We will do so by examining James's focus on the phenomena of religious experience, the attention he gives to intentionality, and his formation of a phenomenological reduction and an eidetic reduction. First, we will consider the phenomena of religious experience and how James gathered his data. James considered his data the numerous ideographic experiences of individuals as dictated in first-hand accounts or scientific studies. James Eady noted that, quote, "William James's greatest single contribution to the study of religious experience was to show us how it could be found, delineated, and defined in a manner which would remain faithful to the uniqueness, the primordiality, and the intrinsic complexity of the experience itself." End quote. Part of this faithfulness to experience is James's analysis of both religious and non-religious phenomena. F.W.H. Myers, a philologist and psychologist in James's time, suggested that if researchers were to attempt to understand supernormal phenomena, they were first tasked with comparing them, as fully as possible, both with normal and abnormal phenomena. If we begin by limiting the phenomena we will consider to phenomena we already consider religious, it will obscure our ability to arrive at a fair definition at the conclusion of our examination. Therefore, throughout the varieties, James considers as religious phenomena, quote, "the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine." James was particularly critical of the tradition of theologians attempting to reach God through proofs. Thus, he was not interested in working towards knowledge of God in that sense, nor of studying the structures of organized religion, such as theologies, creeds, or accounts of church workings. James writes, "Now, in these lectures, I propose to ignore the institutional branch entirely, to say nothing of ecclesiastical organization, to consider as little as possible the systematic theology and the ideas about the gods themselves, and to confine myself as far as I can to personal religion, pure and simple." End quote. James makes clear through his use of qualifiers that it would be unrealistic to suggest that one could ignore these entities entirely. Naturally, they will be mentioned in many of the autobiographical accounts he will consider. However, what he is claiming is that none of those aspects of religion will be central to his discussion, nor will they be suggested as a possible origin of religious experience. The church is only a fractional element of the larger system of personal religion. It is personal religious experience that forms the basis of organized religion, James claimed. Therefore, personal experience is primary, whereas organized religion is merely derivative. As we next consider the epoche, we note that in the varieties, James recognized the responsibility of the observer to perform some form of the phenomenological reduction, and to set aside his or her own values, presuppositions, and the natural attitude. Only in this way can the phenomenologist gain insight into the essential structures of the phenomena. James's method clearly shows that he is setting aside the natural attitude as well as his own values and presuppositions. He claims that personal religious experience, quote, "has its root and center in mystical states of consciousness," and James works to set apart the experience of the individual from any question of the factual nature of the theological claims behind it. It is not important to James whether his reader believes in God, or even whether those he is studying believed in any form of divinity at all. This perspective allows him to gather accounts of experience and analyze them without letting prejudices or pre-existing theological judgments assign value to them. He writes that from his experiential point of view, One must identify even godless or quasi-godless creeds as religions, according to the individual's understanding of what he or she considers divine. Thus, we are not dealing with questions of the origins or values of phenomena, just the experience of them, how they appear to us. Throughout his work, James's method stays true to the complexities of religious experience. He begins with personal accounts of experience, and then attempts to move towards the essential elements of those experiences. His search for the essential qualities of religious experience culminates in the final few chapters of the Varieties. James writes that, quote, "Our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness. Whilst all about it, parted from it by the flimsiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different." End quote. This flimsy screen parts when one is overtaken by a mystical experience. James describes mystical experience as having 4 marks which justify our recognition of it as mystical. These marks have been gleaned from James's extensive analysis of first-hand accounts of religious experiences, and he presents them here as the results of his eidetic reduction of mystical experience. The first 2 marks, ineffability and noetic quality, are nearly always present in mystical experiences. He notes that experiencers often say that these experiences defy expression and cannot be given an adequate explanation in words. Therefore, James abstracts, the unique qualities of mystical experience must be experienced directly in order to be fully understood. He writes, quote, "No one can make clear to another who has never had a certain feeling in what the quality or worth of it contains." End quote. The mystical experience also appears to its experiencer as a state of knowledge. There is some form of insight that is gained in mystical experience which could not be gained otherwise. James notes that this noetic quality carries with it a sense of authority for the experiencer, a feeling of significance and importance that is difficult to detail. James argues that in this way, knowledge given by mystical states of consciousness resembles knowledge given to us through sensation more so than that given by conceptual thinking. Yet those who experience these mystic states of consciousness note that the senses play little to no recognizable role in the reception of the knowledge. The other 2 qualities that James argues are nearly always present, but less distinctive than the first 2, are transiency and passivity. The mystical state of consciousness comes upon the subject without their solicitation and cannot be solicited by repetition of circumstances. James notes that some practices may make one more conducive to bringing on a state of mystical experience, but it cannot be controlled. The experiences are fleeting, rarely as long as a half hour, he says, beyond which they, quote, "fade into the light of common day." Their presence and quality can be remembered vaguely after a time, and yet in their reoccurrence, there is an immediate recognition of their connectivity and continuous development upon the individual. James's chapters on mysticism, as well as being the clearest markers for his phenomenological method, show clearly what James suggested at the beginning of the Varieties, that it is religious experience which forms religions in the first place. Religious experience is central to James's investigation of religion, and thus his phenomenological approach must come to the forefront. James carefully sets limits on the scope of his study, brackets the natural attitude, and sets out to describe the phenomena in detail. He relies on the experiences of individuals across various religions to identify the qualities that make up the invariable core of religious experience. We have shown here how James's work hinges on the same structures of consciousness and approach to inquiry that Husserl will later form concretely into the phenomenological method. Conclusion. In this short work, we have examined the historical background of the intellectual relationship between Edmund Husserl and William James, traced the development of several key phenomenological concepts from James to Husserl, and finally observed them at work in the Varieties. We are now left to highlight 2 essential conclusions that must be drawn from this argument. Foremost, we believe that phenomenological scholarship must acknowledge the contributions William James made to the development of phenomenology. Franklin Davis Duncan writes, quote, "In the field of phenomenology of religion, the most important contribution made by James was the application of his scientific method to the study of religion. He became the first to use a method of phenomenological psychology to examine religious experience." End quote. Although Duncan, E.D. Wilshire, and others we consulted recognized this, many more histories of phenomenology leave out James's role. Considering the great many works written about Husserl, and the numerous historical works on the topic of phenomenology, it is a detriment to scholarship for James to be omitted from these histories. In addition, the phenomenological elements apparent in the varieties must be recognized. In these lectures, James uses a method of investigating religious experience that is still being read and admired today. His work is clear, wide-reaching, and shows the richness of religious experience. For these reasons, and in light of his position in the development of phenomenology, James is a valuable resource for those looking to use phenomenology as a method to study religious experience. Thank you. Do you have time for questions?
Yes. Yes. Questions, please.
Well, let me ask in the beginning, James's kind of pluralistic empiricism doesn't consider truth. I mean, like, he's very particular to say that mystical experience seems veridical, but he doesn't investigate whether it is or isn't. So how is that not psychologism run rampant? There's no real, is there? I mean, I guess I'll make a question. Is there, unlike Husserl, does James have any basis for identifying non-self essences, that is, otherness? Or is everything just, well, whatever you say, that's what you say, and I'll write it down?
I think that in the varieties, his project was more so to gather these accounts and just describe them the way that they're given to him. As far as his work in avoiding psychologism, unfortunately I am not the expert on that side in this paper. That was my colleague John Snarey, so I can't address that directly right now.
Can I just step in? We will have a forum, or at least the hope is to have a forum for dialogue after the conference, and to take this forum online so that out-of-town colleagues can participate in discussion. So if John would like to step in and pick up your question, Bill, that would be great, because I think that's exactly the direction where we should be going, this kind of dialogue. So yeah, we'll talk more about it.
Sure.
Yeah.
I apologize.
Oh, she's just talking.
Any other questions? Yes?
Yes, you quoted someone that the most important influence of James is his scientific method. And I'm wondering, what do you think about his usage of psychedelics? He explored what religion is. He usually experimented with psychedelics. So is it, in your eyes, a scientific method? Is it, because in my perspective, it's in a way real phenomenology.
Yeah, I thank you for that question. I think that's one of the many things that intrigues me about James, is that in addition to gathering these sort of experiences of others, he also tried very hard to bring on his own mystical experience, which many times included the use of psychedelics. There's only one documented account of him having a mystical experience that wasn't brought on by psychedelics, that occurred in, he was hiking in the mountains. But I think, in a way, like you said, it is true phenomenology. He really wanted to understand the experience as deeply as he could, and while that might go against the grain of what we understand as a scientific method in most communities, I think that for James, that was his method. He wanted to deeply experience these things. And unfortunately, as he found, they couldn't be solicited no matter how hard he tried. Thank you. Yes?
First of all, thank you. I didn't get the whole thing because, of course, sadly running up and down. I have two things. First of all would be, does he ever discuss the idea of ecstasy? Not the drug, of course, but spiritual ecstasy. Are you?
I'm trying to think what that would translate to in his language.
Well, because that comes into the idea of really the spiritual experience, is reaching the point of ecstasy. And which brings me to the second part, is it really a religious experience using other forms, something psychedelic, whatever, to come and bring about a religious, pure religious experience?
I think that very reason is why he suddenly moves from the language of religious experiences to mystical experiences, because he wants to broaden the category that he's talking about, so that if we look from the use of psychedelics to very clear-cut religious followers having these experiences, he wants to have a broad range, so that included within these two extremes are what we find to be ordinary religious experiences. So I think his inclusion of those, though we might not understand them as religious exactly, fit into his structure, and thus he wanted to include them.
Can I ask one more?
Please do.
Sorry. Would he consider himself a religious person?
It's an interesting question in scholarship about James. His father was religious, and most people consider him to be religious. But a lot of times in his work, particularly in the varieties, James sort of plays a game with you. He doesn't want to show you his cards, and so he constantly makes it seem like he's not religious. So that is a question in scholarship. I would say that yes, he was, just based on some of his personal writings, but he doesn't want to let that influence his work at all.
Thank you.
Yes.
This question might be a little bit out of the focus on James and Husserl, but James, the philosophical idea of pluralism and radical empiricism, is that view is can be supported by Husserl. I mean, in my knowledge that James didn't give support for the publication of Husserl logical investigation, right? So at that time, James wasn't really, at least for the Husserl, the early stage of the phenomenology, he wasn't sure.
Yeah, no,
Right.
and I think that James would hate to be called a phenomenologist. I don't think that he likes to be pinned down in that way in any sense. And I don't think that he thought that his work was that paralleled with Husserl's.
At least the first or early stage, right?
His early stage,
Yeah,
and he honestly didn't pay much attention to Husserl going into the radical empiricism stage. He thought that the world had enough German philosophers, essentially. He was not a fan. But I think that we can see at least what Husserl is drawing from James, even if James wouldn't appreciate that.
Thank you.
Of course, thank you for your question. Anyone else?
I would like to make a comment.
Okay.
That I'm just so grateful for your and John Snarey's work on this, because after a couple of years ago we lost Eugene Taylor, who was a dear friend of mine and the foremost scholar on James, a historian in psychology, which is a very rare situation. And so he was irreplaceable, at least in my view. And I didn't know if anyone has the same range, the same level of scholarship in James, or this is a missing piece. And so what you are talking about and what you and John are working on, John Snarey, it's just so deeply gratifying to hear and know that this is continuing and that we can have this dialogue. So thank you. Please
Thank
pass
you.
him that.
I will. Yeah, I hope to do my PhD work going to the Husserl archives in Leuven, where I studied, and going a little bit more in depth into where he references James.
Will you also work in Harvard, where?
At the James Center. Possibly.
Yeah, because Eugene Taylor worked there.
Oh.
And so maybe you can access also his library and his notes. I don't know what stage of accessibility is there.
If I could be so lucky, I would love that.
Yeah, okay, well, let's talk about you. Maybe